to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall. Iran says it'll retaliate for the killing of a top nuclear scientist at a time of its choosing.
All enemies of Iran should know very well that the Iranian nation and the country's authorities are too courageous and ardent to leave this criminal act unanswered.
We'll also hear from Israel, which is being blamed by Iran for involvement in the killing. Ethiopian forces reportedly start bombing the capital of its Tigray province. We speak to the European Union's representative in the region, who's calling for dialogue to start immediately. And
Fran Unsworth.
China's ambitious mission to bring back the first rocks from the moon in decades. That's after the news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. The Ethiopian military has begun shelling the besieged capital of Tigray province, where the dissident leadership has refused to surrender. Aid agencies and diplomats have been told by residents there have been explosions in the north of the city. David Bamford reports.
Aid workers in Tigray have confirmed a declaration texted to a news agency by the TPLF leader that Mekelle, a city of 500,000 people, was being shelled. The Ethiopian military has said it intended to seize the city within days, but would seek to avoid harming civilians. The Federal Army earlier said it had advanced to Agula, less than 20 kilometres from Mekelle. The Ethiopian government, under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has rejected ceasefire demands from the African Union, saying it is engaged in a police action. The TPLF has rejected Mr. Abiy's blueprint for a more centralised Ethiopian state.
Iran's leaders have vowed to retaliate for the assassination of its top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. They're blaming Israel. Here's Alan Johnston.
With this killing, Iran's enemies have dealt it a huge and humiliating blow, targeting a key figure on Iranian soil. The big question now is, how will Iran respond? Its military has vowed revenge, but President Rouhani's tone was much more measured. He said vengeance would come, but suggested there be no immediate action. Mr. Rouhani believes that hawks in Israel and the US are setting a trap, wanting Iran to blunder into a major confrontation. But he seems determined to steer clear of that in these last weeks of President Trump's time in office. He's hoping for easier days ahead under a Joe Biden administration, when it might be possible to re-engage with the US and ease the American sanctions that have shattered Iran's economy.
Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam says she has piles of cash at home because US sanctions bar her from accessing banking services. The leader of one of the world's most important financial centres said the government had to use banknotes to pay her salary, nearly $700,000 a year.
I just give you this comment. Sitting in front of you is the chief executive of the Hong Kong SAR, who has no banking services made available to her. I'm using cash every day for all the things. I have piles of cash at home because the government is paying me cash on my salary because I don't have a bank account. I don't want to deter people from serving in a public position because it's very honorable in this set of circumstances to be so unjustifiably sanctioned by the US government is an honor.
News from the BBC. A group of suspected Islamist militants in Indonesia have killed 4 people in a Christian community on the island of Sulawesi. One of the victims was beheaded. Other villagers managed to escape. The attackers burnt down several homes, including one used for worship. Indonesia, where the majority are Muslims, has long battled Islamist extremism. There's also been intermittent conflict between Muslims and Christians. Opponents of a new French law to restrict sharing images of the police are expected to hold dozens of rallies calling for it to be withdrawn. They argue it undermines the freedom of the press to document police abuses. The government says the law protects officers from receiving online abuse. The far-right Alternative for Germany party, the AfD, is beginning a 2-day conference with the court instructing the 600 delegates to wear masks. Many had previously refused to do so. Damien McGuinness reports from Berlin.
Inside the conference venue, AFD delegates are sitting at individual tables wearing masks, something the party was forced to implement after a court ruling. Outside, anti-AFD protesters are waving colourful flags and anti-racism banners. The AFD's party conference has been dubbed a potential corona hotspot by critics. They say gathering 600 people together in a hall for 2 days is irresponsible. This is the only German party to stage a physical conference during the pandemic. So the event is certainly grabbing attention. That might just be the AFD's plan.
Narendra Modi is visiting scientists across India to highlight their work on a coronavirus vaccine. The Prime Minister's meetings with teams in Ahmedabad, Hyderabad and Pune are getting prominent coverage in the Indian media. The move comes as hospitals in Delhi struggle to manage a surge in cases. Analysts suggest the steady return to normal life may have contributed. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm Julian Marshall. The Iranian leadership is today vowing retaliation for the assassination of top Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh on Friday and pointing a finger at Israel. He reportedly died of his wounds in hospital after armed gunmen opened fire on his car in an ambush near Tehran. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has called for the punishing of the perpetrators and those responsible. President Hassan Rouhani has blamed Israel and in a televised cabinet meeting said Iran would retaliate, but at a time of its choosing.
Every think tank and all enemies of Iran should know very well that the Iranian nation and the country's authorities are too courageous and ardent to leave this criminal act unanswered. At an appropriate time, the relevant authorities will respond to this crime. And also, the Iranian nation is too smart and wise to fall into the trap of the Zionists' conspiracy.
Well, Israel has yet to officially comment on the death of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, but they have long had in their sights a man they claim is the mastermind of a covert nuclear weapons program. Back in 2018, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a dramatic presentation in English of what he said was a huge Israeli intelligence haul. He said it proved that Iran had pursued a nuclear weapons program. At one point, he emphasized the role he said Mr. Fakhrizadeh had played.
A key part of the plan was to form new organizations to continue the work. This is how Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, head of Project Ahmad, put it. Remember that name, Fakhrizadeh. So here's his directive. It's right here. And he says, the general aim is to announce the closure of Project Ahmad, but then he adds, special activities, you know what that is, special activities will be carried out under the title of scientific know-how developments.
That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking back in April 2018. Professor Syed Mohammed Marandi is a professor at the University of Tehran and a former member of Iran's powerful Revolutionary Guards. What's the evidence, I asked him, for Israeli involvement in the assassination, as Iran's leaders are claiming?
Well, even the public information that we have, statements coming from inside the Israeli regime itself, as well as public figures in the United States and the American media, already imply that the Israeli regime was involved in the attack. But I'm sure that Iranian intelligence is working on this and to confirm whether they were involved and whether other intelligence organizations were involved as well, because usually in the past, the Israelis did not carry out these sort of operations on their own, but they did it in coordination with other intelligence agencies in the West.
But to use your own word, it is only an implication at the moment. Does Iran have specific evidence of Israeli involvement?
Well, Iranian intelligence agencies obviously are working on this. If they have confirmation, they will announce it. At the moment, they have not said specifically that the Israeli regime was involved. But as I said, even the fact that U.S. senior officials who have spoken publicly or written publicly, as well as those who are quoted unnamed or named by the American media, and Israeli regime officials themselves who've made statements, all of them indicate that the Israelis were involved.
I mean, as far as I know, Israel has declined to comment up until now.
Well, there have been statements made by Israeli officials that were meant to indicate that this could quite have been an operation carried out by the regime.
I mean, it's important, isn't it, to verify who was responsible insofar as Iran is threatening revenge.
Yes, and I'm sure that once it is confirmed, Iran will carry out its retaliation. So otherwise, Iran would have already punished the Israelis, or whoever else was a part of this operation. But at the moment, the Iranians are still carrying out their own investigation. And when that comes out, then the Iranians will respond.
And what form would you expect that vengeance, that retaliation to take?
I would expect that the Iranians strike hard and in a way which prevents its antagonists from thinking about carrying out a similar terrorist attack in future. It was sponsored by a foreign country, and the Iranians have no option but to retaliate. And the irony is, of course, that Western countries fail to condemn such actions. When a former Russian agent is allegedly attacked in England and he doesn't even die, the whole of NATO is up in arms. But when an Iranian senior official is attacked and murdered, Western countries are silent.
Ayatollah Khamenei called Mohsen Fakhrizadeh a prestigious nuclear and defense scientist. The Israelis have described him as the architect of Iran's nuclear weapons program. What did he do?
He was indeed a nuclear scientist, but he was also the deputy minister of defense. And therefore, much of the innovation in Iran in the defense industry was led by him.
Was he in any way involved in what Israel says was Iran's nuclear weapons program?
No, Iran never had a nuclear weapons program. In fact, it was the Israeli regime that fabricated a laptop years ago, claiming that this was evidence that Iran was developing a nuclear weapon. And it later came out that the documents on this laptop were forged by the Israeli regime itself. The Iranian nuclear program has always been used as an excuse to antagonize Iran. And the irony, of course, is that assassinations are carried out in Iran by these very same regimes, yet they are not condemned. They are state sponsors of terrorism, yet it is Iran that is ultimately accused, especially in the Western media, think tanks, among Western pundits and so-called experts. So Iran's nuclear program is legitimate. The IAEA supervises over it, and Iranians continue to be assassinated because of it.
That was Professor Syed Mohammed Marandi in Tehran. Well, in response to that Iranian threat of retaliation, Israel has increased security at its embassies around the world, but as yet, no official comment. Yossi Melman is an Israeli journalist and author of Spies Against Armageddon, Inside Israel's Secret Wars, and joins us now from Tel Aviv. And Mr. Melman, has there been any acknowledgement from Israeli officials, intelligence officials, of Israeli involvement in this killing, in this assassination?
No, there is a complete silence as far as the officials in Israel are concerned. It's now a Saturday, and therefore Israeli politics are at a silent motion. But regardless of it, the Israeli government its intelligence services are not neither confirming nor denying it. And I think this policy will continue.
If indeed this was, though, an Israeli operation, I mean, how audacious was it by the standards of special operations?
I don't know, but it might be attributed to the Israeli intelligence, especially the Mossad. But when you say Israeli intelligence, it's always joint operations. It's from various agencies, not just the Mossad, although the Mossad gets the credit. It was a very daring operation. It was obviously a valuable target. He was the head of, despite what the professor from Tehran said, he was the head of Iran's secret clandestine military program that has been approved and confirmed by the IAEA, which requested him a decade ago or more to come to go and see them for interviewing in Tehran, and the Iranian authorities refused.
But I mean, that was kind of way back in the early 2000s. I mean, subsequently that program was mothballed. Is that not so?
Well, there was a plan called Ahmad, which probably was terminated or halted in 2003. But then at a certain point, it was renewed. And got a different name under auspices of the Ministry of Defense, which is even more incriminating. If it's a civilian program, obviously you don't. Iran has already an atomic energy organization, which is mostly for civilian purposes. Okay. So why do you have a military plan under a nuclear plan under the Ministry of Defense, in which General Fakhrizadeh, and he had the rank of a general, was part of it.
Okay. Mr. Melman, just back to the operation itself, and if indeed it was an Israeli operation, would it have been Mossad agents involved, or would they have subcontracted this to local Iranian operatives?
Well, as I said, it's always, if it was Israeli operation, the spearhead would be the Mossad, but it is assisted by other agencies like SIGINT agency of the military intelligence, and yes, occasionally Israel or the Mossad are not, I wouldn't call it subcontracting, but they are recruiting agents around the world and using agents. Some of them are Israelis, some of them are not Israelis.
But in the case of Iran, would it have been maybe the People's Mujahideen of Iran, known by its Farsi acronym, the MEK?
They are the major opposition, so it could be. There are some there are exile Iranians or Iranians inside Iran who oppose the regime, and maybe they could have assisted the operation. But the Iranian authorities have always accused opposition groups of collaborating with foreign intelligence services, not just the Mossad, the MI6, the CIA.
Mr. Melman, I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to end it there. We're running out of time. Yossi Melman, an Israeli journalist and author of Spies Against Armageddon, Inside Israel's Secret Wars. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour. Still to come, our correspondent reports from the world's biggest vaccine maker in India, where tens of millions of doses of a COVID vaccine are already being produced.
I'm in the facility of Serum Institute of India, and whenever we have final results from Oxford and AstraZeneca, it's this facility that is likely to provide a significant part of the solution to the pandemic.
And the latest headlines from the BBC newsroom. The Ethiopian military has begun shelling the capital of the Tigrayan region as it steps up its campaign against its dissident leadership. But the central government says it wants to avoid civilian casualties. More on that in about 15 minutes. And Iran says it'll retaliate for the killing of a top nuclear scientist at a time of its choosing. This is Julian Marshall with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. And we go now to France, where rallies are taking place across the country by opponents of a new law which would restrict sharing images of the police. The law, which was controversial anyway, has become more so following the distribution this week of footage of police racially abusing and beating a black man. But there are signs that the authorities are having a rethink. The Prime Minister, Jean Castex, announced on Friday that he would appoint a commission to redraft Article 24 of the law, which is the one that would criminalise publication of images of on-duty police officers with the intent of harming their physical and psychological integrity. Mireille Clapeau is an MP for the governing La République En Marche in the French National Assembly. She's on the line now. And you abstained in the vote last Tuesday. What were your concerns?
Hello. Yes, I decided to abstain because the whole Bill of Law globally was not so bad. It was useful because it was written in order to have a continuum between national police, local police and private police. But this Article 24 was added at the last minute with the purpose of avoiding the video images to be put on social networks and used with target to harm physical or psychological integrity. And the wording of this article was not so bad, but there were some interpretations, additional comments that caused confusion. And I realized that there was no consensus about this point, especially as far as press freedom was concerned.
Okay, but you acknowledge, don't you, striking a balance between making the police accountable for their actions and ensuring they are not vulnerable to being picked on, if you like, on social media with the publication of their images?
Well, police is really a pillar of our republic, and the right police is a trained police, experimented, well-equipped and respected by the citizens. And therefore, there must be trust between the citizens and the police. And if there are mistakes or faults, there must be sanctions. And there must be reparations. And the fear of the opponents was that it would be forbidden to take some pictures, which was not written in the article against. But they were afraid that the policemen themselves would tell the citizen, no, please don't take some pictures because it's forbidden by law. And even if it is not exactly the wording of the law, if there is a confusion, we shouldn't give the impression that the policeman will never be controlled and that if there are some evidence of their faults, that there will be above laws.
Okay, just very briefly, do you see this initiative by Jean Castex to redraft the article as addressing your concerns and others?
Well, first of all, I have to remind that the members of parliament are here to write the law. So great if some experts can help us, but the experts will not write the law. It's our role. I think that anyway, we are members of parliament at the national assemblies. At the National Assembly, there will be a shuttle between Senate and National Assembly. Then there is a constitutional court. So I think that time is still needed to come to the right wording. And anyway, I think that there should be a new commission, maybe, reporting to the human rights defenders in France to control that police is well acting.
Mireille Clapeau, an MP for the governing La République En Marche party in the French National Assembly. Now, A Chinese space probe is expected to land on the moon this weekend, China's third moon landing, but the first to try to retrieve rock samples from its surface. State TV footage of the launch earlier this week showed the rocket blasting off into a dark night and carrying the Chang'e probe, named for the mythical Chinese moon goddess, with huge clouds of smoke billowing out beneath.
3、2、1，点火！点火！时3度分2幺秒，8度6毫秒。
And I've been speaking to Katie Joy, a lunar scientist at Manchester University here in the UK, about this latest Chinese lunar mission.
The mission scenario is fairly challenging. We've not sent a robotic mission to the moon to collect samples since 1976. But the big difference is this time is that we're going to be collecting a lot more samples, nearly 4 to 5 times as much that we did in the 1970s. But also the new technology development this time is that they're going to take off back from the moon with the samples on board and then rendezvous in orbit with sort of a mother spacecraft before coming back here to the Earth. And that's never been attempted before robotically. So it's a huge step forward, and it lays the technology groundwork very well for future human plans to explore the moon and China's efforts in getting people to the moon by about 2030.
And what do scientists hope to learn from these rock samples? I mean, what have they learnt before?
Yeah, so we've never been to this region of the moon before. It's in the northwest near side part of the moon, and the mission is going to touch down on some lava flows that we think are very young. So they're probably some of the most volcanically young samples we could collect from the moon's surface, and that's why they're really significant, because they tell us about the moon's geological history through time, and they also potentially help to reveal about the moon's impact history, so when it was being bombarded by asteroids and comets. If they turn out to be these young basalts, that's very exciting to understand how the moon was a geologically complex world in its past.
And how does it work? You would expect China to share the fruits of its research, would you?
Yeah, so many of us are collaborating with Chinese scientists already on studying pieces of moon rocks. And what we think is going to happen is there'll be a period where the Chinese scientists will work on the samples in China, and then hopefully we can collaborate on some of those efforts as well, using the types of instruments and techniques that we use in our labs in the UK and the rest of the world.
And just explain to me how the use of certain technology in this mission will be helpful to China in organising a future manned space landing.
Well, so humans to the moon is an opportunity that many international nations would like to attempt now. And China has suggested that it will send its first people to the moon by about 2030. But this is within a wider context of international efforts by NASA, collaborating with the European Space Agency and other spacefaring nations to get humans to the moon, maybe as soon as 2024. So I think there's an awful lot of interest and excitement in returning to the moon, demonstrating technologies for human sustained presence on the moon before going on to visit more difficult and complex places such as the surface of Mars. So the moon is a really important proving ground over the next 10 years.
China's a relatively late entry to the space race, but seems to be ahead at the moment, is it?
Yeah, this is the 5th of 5 missions now China has sent to the moon, and it's rapidly building up its complexity and sophistication each time. So it's a very exciting time to sort of see how China is becoming such an emerging space power, doing some really exciting missions within the context of sort of the more established spacefaring nations as well. So whilst we're probably not in the same kind of space race we were in the 70s between the US and the Soviet Union, certainly the competition is really actually pushing things forward a lot more, and is exciting and interesting for sort of where things might go next.
Katie Joy, lunar scientist at Manchester University here in the UK. Do stay with us here on NewsHour. A lot more to come in the next 30 minutes.